Welcome to the deep dive, where we kind of help you wrap your head around those like really big ideas.
Yeah. Yeah.
And today we're diving into this idea of essential versus accidental properties.
All right.
Which sounds a little bit abstract at first.
It does.
But I think it's going to really change how you see yourself and everything around you.
Yeah, it really does get at like what makes you you and what makes a thing that thing.
So to guide us today, we've got the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry.
Perfect.
On essential versus accidental properties.
It's a great source.
Yeah, it's a really in-depth article.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I'm excited to kind of pick your brain about this one.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things about this topic is that it goes beyond just like, defining words or coming up with categories.
Yeah.
You're really trying to figure out what makes a thing that thing.
Okay.
And when we say that, what are the absolute must-haves versus the stuff that could be different and it would still be that thing?
Yeah. Okay, so let's start with those definitions because I'm already feeling a little bit like I'm back in philosophy class here.
Okay, sure.
So break it down for me. What exactly are essential and accidental properties?
So philosophers often use what's called a modal characterization to explain this.
Oh, yeah.
And basically, an essential property is a thing absolutely must have to be what it is.
Okay.
It's so fundamental that it couldn't exist without it.
So give me a real world example because I'm all about making this stuff relatable.
Sure. So let's think about Socrates.
Okay.
The philosopher, to be Socrates, he has to be human.
Right.
That's non-negotiable.
Okay.
Being human is an essential property of Socrates.
Okay, so it's like a defining characteristic.
Yeah.
Without it, poof, no more Socrates.
Yep.
So what about all those other things that are true about him, but maybe not quite so fundamental?
So those would be what we call the accidental properties. And they're the things that just happen to be true about something, but could have been different without changing the essence of the thing. Okay.
So, for example, maybe Socrates was a dog lover, but he could have preferred cats and he'd still be Socrates.
All right. So liking dogs is an accidental property.
Yep.
It doesn't make or break his Socraticness.
Exactly.
I'm with you so far, but what throws me off a little bit is this whole idea of like must versus could.
Yeah.
Are we talking about what we like know is possible or something else entirely?
So that's where things get a little mind-bendy.
Okay.
Because we're not talking about what's possible based on what we currently know or even the laws of physics as we understand them.
Okay.
It's about what's metaphysically possible.
Okay.
So it's about exploring all the different ways something could exist, even in some alternate reality.
So even if it's completely bonkers, like the Eiffel Tower being made of cheese, if it's conceivable, on some level, it's metaphysically possible.
You got it. And that helps us understand essential properties.
So think of it this way. What could have been different about something versus what must be true about it no matter what?
Okay, I think I'm starting to see the distinction.
Good.
But something that's still bugging me, you have to actually exist to be anything.
Right.
So where does existence fit into this whole essential versus accidental thing?
That is a great question, and it brings up a tricky point.
Okay.
Because if we stick with just that basic modal view, we'd say that for my dog, Emma, existing is essential to being a dog. But it also feels weird to say existence is essential.
Yeah.
Because she could have not been born.
Right, like if her parents had never met.
Exactly.
She wouldn't exist.
Right.
So is existence an accidental property?
Right.
Seems like we're stuck between a rock and a hard place.
It's definitely a head scratcher.
Yeah.
So existence is kind of a special case.
Okay.
And philosophers often treat it that way.
Okay.
But remember, the big question here is what's absolutely fundamental to a thing, even if it means wrapping our brains around some pretty abstract ideas.
I'm ready for my brain to be wrapped.
Okay.
But before we go any further,
Yeah.
I think we need to address the elephant in the room here.
You sure?
Not all philosophers are on board with this whole modal characterization, right?
You're right. Yeah, there are some philosophers who think that the modal view is maybe a bit too broad.
Okay.
They think that it ends up including properties that don't feel truly essential to a thing's nature.
Ooh, dissenting opinions.
Yeah.
I think, give me the details. Who is leading this rebellion against modal essentiality?
So one of the most prominent critics is a philosopher named Kit Fine.
Okay.
And his argument is basically that the modal view makes things essential that are really just about like relationships or external factors, not the object's core identity.
Okay. I'm intrigued. Give me an example.
Sure. So Fine uses this example of the number 2
Good.
and the set that contains only the number 2.
Okay.
So you have the set and it only has 2 as a member.
Got it.
And so obviously it's true that 2 is a member of that set.
Right.
is part of its definition.
Right.
But Fine argues that that doesn't mean that being a member of this specific set is part of the number two's own definition.
Wait, so you're saying even though it's true that the number two is in that set, it doesn't actually tell us anything fundamental about the number two itself?
Exactly.
That seems kind of counterintuitive.
Yeah, and that's Fine's point, is that those kinds of properties are more about relationships than essence.
Okay.
And he says that the modal view basically casts the net too wide.
Okay.
And ends up including properties that are just accidentally true.
Okay.
Based on how things happen to be arranged in the world.
So how does he propose we fix this problem? Does he have like an alternative to the modal view?
He does. He calls it the definitional characterization.
Okay.
And the idea here is that essential properties are those that are part of an object's like core definition.
Okay.
So it's about what makes a thing that kind of thing, rather than just what happens to be true about it in a particular circumstance.
Okay, that makes sense. But I can already see where this gets tricky, because how do you even go about defining things in a way that captures their essence?
Exactly.
It's not like we have a dictionary for all of reality.
Yeah, you hit on the main critique of Fine's approach right there, is that defining definition itself becomes a philosophical rabbit hole.
Right.
But his point, I think, is still important, because it forces us to think carefully about what we consider truly essential and whether the modal view accurately captures that.
So what about the philosophers who are sticking with the modal view? Are they just ignoring Fine's objections?
No, not at all. And in fact, some philosophers have proposed sort of modifications to the modal view that try to address Fine's concerns.
Okay.
So for example, Edward Zalta suggests that maybe we need to think differently about essential properties depending on what kind of thing we're talking about.
Okay, I'm listening. Different kinds of things, different kinds of essences.
Exactly. So Zalta distinguishes between what he calls ordinary objects, like you and me and Socrates, and abstract objects, like numbers or concepts.
Got it.
And he says these two categories might have different types of essences.
Okay.
So for ordinary objects, he argues that their essential properties are those that they have if they exist in a concrete form.
So it's like a conditional essentiality.
Yeah.
If Socrates happens to be chilling in a physical body, then he has to be human.
Right.
But maybe there are worlds where he exists in some non-physical form and those rules don't apply.
That's a great way to put it, yeah.
Okay.
So Zalta suggests that maybe there are different rules for different realms of existence.
Okay.
And then when it comes to abstract objects, he talks about encoding properties.
Okay.
So these are properties that are built into our very conception of the object, even if it doesn't exist in a concrete way.
So like the fictional character Sherlock Holmes encodes the property of being a detective, even if he never actually existed to solve any real-life mysteries.
Exactly. It's like those properties are part of the blueprint for the concept, whether or not it manifests in the physical world.
Got it.
So even within the modal view, there are different approaches to defining and understanding essential properties.
This is making me realize there's a whole spectrum of essentialism, right?
Yeah.
Some philosophers think like a lot of things are essential, while others are more minimalist about it.
You're absolutely right. Think of it like a spectrum of essentiality.
Okay.
On one end, you have what are called the maximal essentialists, like Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz.
Okay.
He believed that every single property a thing has is essential.
Wow.
There's no room for accident at all.
Okay.
And then on the other end, you have the minimal essentialists, like J.L. Mackie.
Okay.
He argued that very, very few things are truly essential.
So a maximal essentialist would say that I'm essentially wearing these specific socks today, and there's no possible world where I could be wearing any other pair. That seems a bit extreme.
It does, and most philosophers fall somewhere in between those two extremes.
Okay.
And there are different flavors of essentialism, each focusing on different aspects of a thing's nature.
Oh.
So, for example, there's origin essentialism, which focuses on the idea that a thing couldn't have had a different origin.
So the idea that Socrates couldn't have been born to different parents, that's origin essentialism.
Exactly.
Okay, I'm starting to get the hang of these labels.
Good.
What else? What other flavors are there?
So there's also sortal essentialism.
Okay.
Which says that a thing can't be a fundamentally different kind of thing.
Okay.
So Socrates has to be a human. He couldn't suddenly become a toaster oven.
All right. That makes sense. There's some basic categories that feel pretty fundamental.
Right.
But what about the folks who are just like totally skeptical of this whole essentialism thing?
Yeah.
Are there any anti-essentialists out there shaking things up?
Oh, absolutely. Anti-essentialists would say that essential properties don't really exist independently of how we think about or refer to things.
Okay.
They say it's all about perspective and context.
Give me an example. My brain is starting to feel like it needs a break from all this abstract thinking.
Sure. So think about the number 9.
Okay.
We can call it 9. We can call it 7 plus 2, or we can call it the number of planets in our solar system.
Okay.
An anti-essentialist would say that whether a property like being greater than 7 seems essential.
Okay.
Depends on how we're describing the number.
Okay.
Not because it's some inherent truth about 9 itself.
So it's like how we might describe a person.
Yeah.
If we're thinking about them as a scientist, then being rational and logical might seem essential.
Right.
But if we're focusing on their hobby as a marathon runner, then being physically fit seems more crucial.
Precisely.
Okay.
So anti-essentialists argue that what we pick out as essential is really just a reflection of our own way of looking at the world, not some objective truth about the objects themselves.
Wow. So this whole debate goes way beyond just defining terms. It's really about, like, how much of our identity in the world's structure is fixed versus flexible. This is getting pretty deep.
It is, and it gets even more complex when we start asking how we even know any of these essentialist claims if they're true at all.
Oh, boy.
But that's a conversation for the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, so my brain is officially prepped for, like, the final leg of this essentialism journey.
Right.
Last time we were debating whether these essential properties even, like, exist at all.
Right.
But let's say for the sake of argument, we buy into the idea. How do we actually know what those essential properties are?
So that's where we get into the realm of what's called modal epistemology,
Okay.
which is basically how we gain knowledge about what's necessary, possible, or impossible.
Okay.
And it's a tricky business because our senses only tell us about the world as it is,
Right.
not all the ways it could have been.
So how do we bridge that gap?
Yeah.
Do we just have, like, some sort of sixth sense for essential truths?
Well, some essentialist claims do seem pretty intuitive.
Okay.
Like, take math, for example.
Okay.
We know, without even having to observe it, that the number 2 is essentially even.
Right.
It's just part of its nature.
Right.
But when we move beyond math, things get a bit murkier.
Okay. Yeah. Like the idea that Socrates had to be born to his specific parents.
Right.
We know that from history books.
Right.
But could we have ever known that just by thinking about it?
So that's a great example.
Yeah.
Saul Kripke, who's a major figure in essentialism,
Okay.
argued that we figure out some essential properties through a combination of pure reason and observation.
Okay. So it's like a two-step process.
Yeah.
We might have a gut feeling that, say, like, every living thing has a unique origin.
Right.
But then we need our senses to actually figure out what that origin is.
Exactly.
Okay.
So in Socrates' case, we combine that general principle with the historical fact of his parentage.
Gotcha.
Of course, not everyone agrees that origin is truly essential.
Right.
So even if you accept essentialism, there's still room for debate about which claims actually hold up.
Oof. It seems like every time we answer one question, 2 more pop up.
Yeah, that's philosophy for you.
But I guess that's what keeps it interesting.
It does.
But beyond just figuring out, like, what's essential and how we know it, this whole debate has some pretty big implications, right?
Absolutely.
Like, we're not just talking about the properties of, like, rocks and trees here.
No.
Essential properties are, like, central to discussions about identity.
Yeah.
Particularly when it comes to the philosophy of mind. Okay, so we're talking about what makes a person a person. I knew this would get personal eventually.
Right.
Does essentialism have something to say about that whole, like, mind-body problem?
You bet. One of the most famous arguments for mind-body dualism.
Okay.
The idea that your mind and body are separate things relies on essential properties.
All right, I'm all ears laid on me.
So here's the basic argument. You are essentially a thinking thing.
Okay.
A conscious being. Your body, on the other hand, is essentially a physical thing.
Mm-hmm.
It can exist without consciousness.
Okay.
So because you and your body have these different essential properties, they can't be the same thing.
So because you and your body have different essential properties, they can't be the same thing. That's pretty clever.
That's the gist of it, yeah.
Okay.
And it's a classic argument using what's called Leibniz's law, which basically says if 2 things are identical, they have to share all their properties, including the essential ones.
But hold on. Doesn't that kind of contradict the fact that I could lose a limb or even get a heart transplant and still be me?
Right.
My body changes, but my identity stays the same.
That's a great point. And this is where things get even more complex.
Oh, boy.
So philosophers have used essentialist arguments not just for the mind-body problem, but also for the idea that objects themselves change over time.
Okay, now you're really making my head spin. Give me an example.
Sure. So think of a statue made entirely out of clay. We'll call him David.
Okay, David the clay statue.
Yep. So at this moment, the statue and the lump of clay occupy the same space.
Right.
They have the same weight, same color, everything.
So at this moment, they seem like the same thing.
Right.
But I'm sensing a but coming.
But the statue is essentially human-shaped.
Okay.
It couldn't exist as that statue without that shape.
Right.
The lump of clay, on the other hand, isn't essentially human-shaped. It
Right.
could be molded into anything.
So even though they're identical right now,
Yeah.
they have like different possibilities for the future.
Exactly.
David is destined to be David, while the clay could become like a pot or a bust of someone else or a million other things.
Exactly. And because of that difference in their essential properties,
Okay.
we could argue that they are not actually the same thing.
Which is pretty mind-blowing when you consider that they share all those accidental properties at this moment.
It is.
Wow, this whole essentialism thing is really making me think differently about identity. It's not just about what a thing is now, but also what it could or couldn't become.
That's right.
And that brings us back to, I think, like the big question here. If some things are truly essential about you,
Yeah.
does that limit your freedom or define who you are?
That's the ultimate question, isn't it?
It really is. I mean, can you change your core values, your beliefs, even your personality and still be the same person?
Right.
Or are there some like fundamental you-ness properties that make you you no matter what?
And that's a question for all of us to ponder, I think.
Well, we've gone from Socrates to prime numbers to clay statues and back again.
Been quite a journey.
It has been. It's been quite the journey. But I think the real exploration starts now.
Yeah.
So thank you for kind of walking us through this.
My pleasure.
This whole world of essentialism.
Yeah.
I think it's something that, it goes way beyond just philosophy.
It does.
And it really gets at the heart of what it means to exist.
Absolutely.
So I encourage everyone listening to kind of take some time to think about what your own essential properties are.
Yeah.
What makes you you?
Right.
And could those things ever change?
Great questions to ponder.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into essentialism.
Thanks for having me.
We'll see you next time for another dive into the big ideas that shape our understanding of the world.